Today's top story from the perspective of someone who's there.
You are looking live.
This just in.
Not my beat.
Oh, it is certainly his beat. John Keim, ESPN, been on the Commanders beat for officially a very long time and had a great piece this weekend on ESPN.com about how the Commanders and really when the Commanders landed on Jayden Daniels. And I'm so fascinated by this process, John, because we heard you and others talk about how there's a lot of signs that are pointing to Jayden, but who knows, because Adam Peters doesn't talk to anybody. And then you have this anecdote in the piece. You lay the scene of when Peters tells the rest of the organization, basically, that it is Jayden Daniels. So I'm going to start with a classic two-part question here, but why did so many people think it was Daniels? And then what was the process that led to Peters not necessarily picking Daniels, I do want to get into that, but to actually telling everyone that, yes, you are in fact correct, it is Jayden?
So, the second part, because I'm going to remember that one before I remember the first part, because I'm going to ask you to repeat that question. But anyways,
that's why our journalism professors tell us not to do two-part questions.
Well, I do them too. But on the second part, part of it is that building knew, anybody you talk to would be, he likes Jayden, right? But you didn't know, is it going to be him for sure? And part of the uncertainty was, because even in that meeting, somebody asked him, well, what if the Bears don't take Caleb Williams? Then what? What if the Bears, for example, what if they took Jayden Daniels? Then what? So I think they didn't want to be locked into publicly saying anything because there was the you never know. Or what if somebody gave you a haul for that number 2 pick, which never came? But what if Minnesota gives you two number ones and Justin Jefferson? Well, you might be tempted by that. So then that was part of the reason why he wanted to kind of wait. And also throughout this process, Craig, Bob Myers, who built the Warriors as a GM, has been consulting here, was not involved in not involved in the scouting the players, but he was a sounding board for Adam Peters. And part of what he would tell him is, and I think sometimes it's just reiterating something. It's not like Adam didn't know some of this stuff, but it's reiterating, you don't have to make a decision until you do. So throughout this, they always liked Jayden Daniels, but it was always go through the process, respect the process, because you never know. And each step of the way, it was him. So you get to on the clock, when the Bears are on the clock, that's when he told. Now, ownership groups, they knew shortly before that, but that's when everybody else kind of gathered in that war room, scouts, others executives and all that. That's when he told them, was when the Bears were on the clock. And I think, again, it's because you never know. And also because they didn't want people going out there and saying anything either. That's why it was always signs point to, because unless you may hear from others there how much he likes a guy, but unless you hear him say he is the guy, you can't run with it. And throughout this, that's what you would hear. And when you talk to other people, and Greg, you talk to, you know how this works. You talk to other coaches in the league. They all said Jayden Daniels. So logic and other things you heard pointed to him all along. But you also heard he really likes J.J. McCarthy too. That was that, is he going to throw a curveball here? And that was the only part you didn't know, but everything though pointed to him. And the other part of that is, even during the coach search, you would hear, Ben Johnson, but you would get nudged off that once in a while. And hey, this is not a lock. You would hear that, right? And you would hear things that may say, well, a lot of people like Dan Quinn. In this case, I never heard anybody say Jayden's not a lock. It was always I think it's Jay. I think it. So that's why it went that. That's why I kind of thought that way. I think, did that answer both?
I was going to say, it's hilarious, John. You answered both parts of the question.
All right,
see,
there you go.
Take that, journalism professors. I asked a 2-part question. He didn't even get both parts, and he answered them both anyway. You love to see it. John Keim with us, of course, the John Keim Report, and read his work, such as the piece that we're discussing right now on ESPN.com. I want to circle back to this idea that you talk to everybody in the league, or not everybody, but you talk to a lot of coaches in the league
you get a sense.
about. Yeah, actually, John knows everybody that's associated with the NFL, and he talked to all of them over the last 5 minutes. No, but you talk to other coaches around the league, and the league seems so much higher on Jayden than PFF or other media scouts. And we've been told for a long time it was Drake. Obviously, JJ comes on late, as well after the season he had, and people pour into his tape and they like what they see there. But what was the thing about Daniels that Peters and Quinn and everybody here, as well as others in the league, liked and I guess more importantly, John, valued more than people from the outside who looked at the big time throws or some of the other things, the analytics that suggested that Drake May was the better prospect?
Well, first of all, I talked to somebody who, like, they had somebody from a team who had someone who works on, for PFF is like, I'm not going to have this person to make our pick. So, like, in other words, the analytics are helpful. They're not making a choice here. Okay.
Right.
So, like,
what I always remind people about analytics is that analytics are just data. Who interprets them and whether or not that data is used well is whether or not analytics is helping or hurting you.
Right. And then you also have to look into the why of everything. Like, just looking at the numbers, it tells you something, but do you know what he's being asked to do within this offense? Do you know what this is going on here? What's his read, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's so much more to learn that they're going to know. So going back to the first part, though, with the other coaches, and listen, when Dan Quinn was on with the Junkies, he said it. Like, these clues were hiding in plain sight for a long time, because when they did the word association thing, and he gets to Caleb Williams, it's DC, Drake May, it's athlete, Jayden Daniels, it's a game changer. I'm like, game changer, game over. So right now, in hindsight, and I also talked to someone who said Dan may have said too much at that time, because that was clearly, now it was so early in the process. Well, actually, it was late February.
It was at the combine.
So,
I remember the treadmill I was on at my hotel in Indy when I was listening to the podcast of that interview.
And that's also when the time where they told Josh Harris, and in that room, it's like, it's going to be him unless somebody knocks him off. So it's right around that time where it's like, there's this, but anyway, so when you hear that game changer, that's what coaches gravitated to, that aspect. And it's hard to find guys like that. And one of the things that I talked to Dan Quinn about at the league meetings was, you're a defensive coach. So how does that, when you're looking through a defensive coach's eyes, what are you looking for? And his thing, there's a couple things with that. And this is also another clue, another piece of that puzzle. Because he told me that, you're, as a defense coach, what are you trying to do? You're trying to confuse the quarterback post-snap. So you get the, disguise coverage and all that. So flip side is, who can best read that or adjust to a post-snap movement? And he liked how Jayden Daniels handled it, because he even said, like, you see a lot in the SEC, and he liked how his processing speed. So those are things that jumped out. And when you talk to other people, like, those are the traits that people saw. And the legs are a massive weapon. And that was the other beauty part for him. And that's where the game changer part comes in. But it's also the evolution of him as a passer too. Like, that was a big deal as well. So I think those are the things that added up to when you talk to people like, I was surprised how many people all went that way. And it wasn't just, it was coaches, it was other people who are in that community, that scouting community, not just head coaches, but some assistant coaches, some other, whatever. Like, that's where they all gravitated to. And, one coach told me simply, he's a stud. Another said he's a home run. So, like, this is what the scouting process led to. And that's why, like, so logically, even before we got to the point where, like, this is where I think it's going to go, it's like, logically, this is where you almost have to go. Because if all these coaches are saying this, how are they not seeing the same things? And so I think, like, that's what you'd hear is the game changer part. And again, it's not a great arm, it's a good arm. But again, his evolution as a passer, he's not, as someone else told me, he's a passer who can run. It's not vice versa. And too often with running quarterbacks, you might see the flip side, the reverse of that. That's the other part that was attractive to him.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's just interesting because we were sold that it was May and Williams for so long that all of a sudden, like, people go through the process and it seems unanimous. And one of the funniest ones to me was watching some of the clips back from draft night, Belichick, and, like, kind of watching Belichick break down May's tape. And it's kind of funny too, because it's the Patriots who wind up taking him.
Right.
But there seems to be just a disdain in Belichick's voice as he's breaking down the tape, and he's like, yeah, that one's good. This is bad. This is not good enough. This needs to be cleaned up. And you're like, oh, coaches really don't like the messed up footwork, the inconsistency. And then you watch them watch Jayden, and you're just like, this is what it should look like. And and that seems to be the thing that was so much more elevated in people who actually make these decisions versus the projection game over here, if you will, for Drake May.
1,000%. And the footwork was a big deal for Drake May and how that had to be cleaned up. And for Jayden Daniels, there's always little things. I think you can, like, some people would talk about like maybe getting his lower half more involved on some of the out routes, right? So to drive it just a little bit more. But the footwork has always been pretty good. And in talking to other people, like they think he can do more because of how he's been taught with his footwork, that it wasn't always highlighted at LSU, for example. So there, in terms of like different routes you can run based off how he handles the footwork associated with these routes. And this is one of the things that too, like that's a big deal. And I think because like, it's not just, it's a 3-step drop, it's a 5-step drop, it's a 7-step drop. There are different kinds of 3-step drops. There are different kinds of 5-step drops depending on the route. And then, so there are a lot then, and it's more than just 3 varieties. So that's the part that they felt like he was good at as well. And I think with Drake May, you saw that, and that's what you'd hear, is that it's going to take him a little bit. Not that he can't get there. Like you talk to people here and they're like, they think Jayden, Drake, and JJ and Penix can all be good quarterbacks in the league. Now, we all know the numbers work against them, or the history works against that happening, but I think they feel really good about that group in general. So it's not like May can't get there,
right.
But he does need work with that. And here's the other thing. Like the other thing people would look at too is I think they're all good competitors. I think in their own way, they're good leaders. Now, Daniel's a little bit more quiet, but guys follow him. And one of the things that Peters liked, from what I was told too, especially, is that, and he talked about that, about the getting the pass codes changed to get the after hours workouts in, but also then he was getting these receivers up at 5 a.m. to go work out. Like, and one guy told me, he's like, I would tell him to bleep off, just jokingly, like, how many college receivers are going to be willing to put in that kind of work? Why are they doing that? Well, is it this guy? You know what I mean? Like, so that stuff, that's leadership as well. And that's what they saw. And then like the competitiveness in games, and he took over games. He had really good receivers, but he dominated some games with that, with his arm and his legs. And you didn't see that to that level with others. I mean,
right.
And that's what you'd hear. So, and I mean, like Drake May had some really good moments, but I think where you see the projection with him is, can you get to take those really good moments and turn them into really good games? And you saw that transformation with Daniels. And then the other thing is, I know like the ceiling aspect is another part too, Craig. And I think when you talk to people, like they liked how much he improved at LSU based on doing some of that virtual reality technology and all that. So they feel like it's not like he stopped, like he can progress more as a passer because he made a big jump once he started doing certain things, right? And I think that's why the ceiling part, and I know the assumption was one can hit it has a higher ceiling. I don't know that the NFL agrees with that necessarily. Listen, I say NFL, there's so many opinions in that league that some will and some won't. But for here,
the majority opinion, it certainly seems like that.
Correct. But for here, I would say that, I know people who know Dan as well, like he's certainly not at his ceiling.
John Keim, ESPN.com, with us here on the Hoffman Show. So you wrote in the piece about how ownership got informed slightly before. Mm-hmm. I would assume that DQ knew who Peters was. That had to be the guy that he was most closely working with, I guess, along with and Lance Newmark, the assistant
Josh,
GM. Yeah. Who else was brought in and an opinion was either valued or kept informed through the process? And I guess Cliff is the most interesting character in that formula because, is he a guy that they are saying like, this is your quarterback, and not that we don't care what you think, but like this may not have been your number one choice, or maybe it was Cliff's number one choice.
I think
what was the formula there in terms of how tight the inner circle was and who knew when?
Well, listen, at the combine, the ones who were also there was Cliff was part of that group too. So, and then the scout was Peter Pecorelli, who had Adam thanked him at the press conference, but he obviously had a big role. I think, listen, Doug Williams was called in to provide input too. So now, how strong or how much you're listening to everybody, I don't know that, but I think within that tight circle would be Cliff and Dan obviously as well. So, and Newmark would be another guy too. I think that there's a tight circle, and then there's a little bit of an outer circle, and then there's others or everybody else. But so yeah, I mean, it was Cliff would obviously had a big part because he was in the first meeting too in the combine, and that's I think one of the things that won him over there because those are quick interviews, and one of the things that because even in the piece I mentioned it, but one of the things that won him over was he walks in and he's not like Drake May is a you come in and he's there, right? He's got a presence. JJ McCarthy, I'm told he's very personable, and that's a really good quality. Daniel's a little bit more reserved, but when they put on the film, they said you could just see the change, and it was just like the eyes lit up and the energy for him, just like it was all about the film. And like it reminded me of when Dan Quinn interviewed, and they talked about the passion he had during this one interview, during his in-person interview, and how much it mattered to him. It wasn't because he's like jumping up off the walls and all that, but it's because the passion he displayed for something. And I think they saw that with him in the film. And again, Cliff was part of that group as well.
What did you learn about Peters and his scouting ethos, if you will, through reporting this piece that you see then applied to the rest of the draft and you think will hold true in the future?
I think it applies to everything. I think it's the way you go about decisions. And I think what you saw is because we really first saw it during the coaching search. And it's a respecting of the process. And during the now, I think if they had one prominent guy, for sure, this is the guy that they're targeting, they'd have gone after him hard right away. I think they felt like they had several really good candidates and wanted to go through the process and not shortchange or disrespect that process, but not shortchange the process for fear of maybe making an impetuous decision or whatever. So like when Raheem Morris lets him know he's got an offer for the Falcons, they're not changing the process because they haven't talked to everybody. They only talked to a few of them. They needed to talk to, they had hoped to talk to Ben Johnson still. They still wanted to talk to Dan Quinn again. They wanted to talk to, Mike McDonald again. So, and Aaron Glenn. And so all those guys. And so I think like there's a respect in the process and like trying not to get emotionally attached right now and maybe missing something down the road. So I think you saw that in this. I think there was a working hard to, yes, it's, February 29th, Jayden Daniels, yep, all on board, yep, okay, next step. Still there, yep, next step. And but go through it with J.J. McCarthy and Drake May and Penix because you don't know. So I think there's a, in this process, desire to be prepared. Because if you just say, hey, it's Jayden, let's just go. And then what if you learn late in the process that something new comes out or something, you find out something or you see something you don't like, whatever. Well, now what do? Are you prepared to go in a different direction? So that's partly why you don't settle on somebody too early in that spot because there's no rush. So I think that's some of it. And I think you can see the approach in the draft was, and I think you would hear this. Now, here's the other thing. We're talking about this. We don't know how this is going to work out, with this draft class. On paper, it looks good because I think there was an approach and a plan to it. And that was draft really good players. So if Johnny Newton is there in the second round and you have him as a first round grade, take the fricker, bring the guy. Because you know what I mean? Like he's a really good player. And there's nothing bad with having three potentially good defensive tackles and who can rush the passer. Like that's a good thing. And I know you needed a tackle there and you want a tackle, but this is the guy, like you build good teams with good players. And you don't build it by settling for somebody. So I think there was like that respecting of that part of the process, but also then you look at what kind of descriptors are you using for these guys? Tough, team leader. Like, you want guys who are tough, you draft tough players. You want guys who are smart, you draft smart players, right? So I think there was some of that you saw too. And again, I don't, that's what you see. Now, again, how it turns out, who the heck knows? But leading into this at this step, that's what I've seen. And that I felt like that was true in free agency too. And knowing who you are and who you want, that was to me a failure of the past, and past for a while, right? It wasn't just the last couple of years. It was the last 10 or whatever, where, Jay Gruden would talk about this, getting stuck with guys like that the coaches didn't want. And yet Bruce Allen and Dan Snyder would decide, well, this is the guy we're going to take. And whether it's Paul Richardson, Zach Brown, whomever, and then keeping them around, like even after they knew like they don't fit and the coaches don't want them, hey, re-sign them anyway. So I think there's more, being in sync, I think. But again, first year, everything sounds great. First year, everything goes smooth, and then we'll see. But that's what you learn. So I think there's more of a process and a plan and approach to building a roster than we've seen in a while. Again, now it all depends. Did they get the right guys?
Right. Last thing I want to end with here, John, is John Keim from ESPN.com is our guest. They go through this whole secretive process to land on Jayden at number 2, and that works when you're at number 2, and it's a quarterback especially. It's a very unique kind of draft process. Like, obviously, they went through the rest of their draft process to get the rest of their prospects. But do you imagine that there's like what does it look like for the first round next year is really the core of what I want to ask. It's like when they get to next year, like, does it just look like a higher up the chart version of round 2 and down, or is there's some elements of this incredibly unique number 2 pick with number 1 already decided being Caleb Williams' Chicago draft process that infiltrate how they treat round 1 in the future?
I don't know. That's a good question. And here's the other thing, like they just got here, so we're just starting kind of learning them and how things go. I wouldn't be surprised if next year you kind of have an idea of like, hey, here are 5 or 6 guys that you like in this area, because that's how it's kind of been in the past too, for a few regimes where you have an idea of guys they like, but nobody knows for sure, because if you're picking 19th or whatever, you don't know who's going to be there. Like, right. It doesn't unfold the way they don't aggregate all the mock drafts and say it's going to go like this. Now they do look at them just to see how some team's thinking or whatever, but you don't know how it's going to unfold on that night. So you have an idea of 4 or 5 guys. I'm going to guess that you at least know some guys you can cross off. But here's the other thing, like, and there have been times even the last couple of years where like I knew that there's some guys they really, really liked, or that there was a guy they really, really liked at a certain spot, but they may not say because they may feel like that guy might go higher than some people think, and they don't want anything coming out about that player attached to them because for fear of maybe missing out. So it's not like you always knew everything before, right? So I think, and usually it's like if you're 16, 17, 18, 19, or even lower, you're going to have choices of guys, and maybe, but it's hard, it's hard to know because oftentimes like they're going to know who they like, but they're not going to know who's going to be there. So, but yeah, I think you'll have a little bit more of an idea of some of the likes and dislikes, or maybe a little bit more of what they're looking for as well.
Yeah. I just wonder if like internally how, when you don't have a super tight circle because you're trying to protect one piece of information, like what does that look like? But I do think, John, at the very least, we're probably past being told by front office people, hey, if it's this, the owner walked in. So I think we're good on that, because there's been more than I wasn't on the beat that long, but I think it happened multiple times.
It did happen a couple of times, and you know what? It didn't work out, surpringly.
No,
but that's
stunningly.
Like there's the one, and like Josh Harris obviously going to be involved. Every owner is going to be involved to a degree, and you should be. You paid billions, of course you're going to be. The difference is like he may have sometimes ideas of guys like, hey, what about this guy? He'll ask questions. You're going to have to produce information for him, but he's not making the pick. So mean, that's why I laugh when people say like, "Oh, they just picked Jayden to fill seats." Well, first of all, Jayden Daniels is going to sell tickets. Secondly, if he was going to do that, then every team would have made the same decision to sell tickets, right? Because they all there were some very accomplished coaches who really liked this kid, so it wasn't just about that. But and I'm not even sure, if Dan Snyder were here, then you wonder about that initially. But with this guy, it's ask a lot of questions. He's going to be demanding because that's just how he runs his businesses.
He's also good at asking questions because he's actually smart.
Right.
Which is a relevant plot point.
But it's also and sometimes those questions can create more work for your guys. However, it should also make them more informed about the decisions they're making. Because if you have to say, if somebody asks you Craig, why did you talk about this in this segment or why did you do this? You're going to think about it and have to answer to that. And maybe you realize well, this is why, and this makes sense. Okay, that's great. Just wondering. But if you can't provide a good answer, then they're going to say, well, have you thought about doing this or that? So I think I think it can help prepare you and maybe affirm your beliefs as well. And I think that's part of what it is. So we'll see. But yeah, but you did not have, there was nobody telling the owner this time that you just made the biggest bleeping mistake after drafting a quarterback. So that didn't happen this time.
Yeah. No, definitely did not.
John
Keim, ESPN, the John Keim Report is the podcast, and you can read the piece on how the Commanders landed on Jayden Daniels and kept it a secret from, even people inside the building, kind of, on ESPN.com. John, always appreciate your time.
And just one last thing on that, Craig, to that point, I talked to somebody that morning, and they're like, I think it's Jayden, but he does really like JJ. So it's there was really just a little bit of a doubt, just a little bit. But anyways, thank you for having me on. Always enjoy it.